From In the Beginning to the 100th episode, this is The Bible Says What. I'm your host, Mike Wiseman. Welcome to The Bible Says What Centennial Show. The question at the back of my mind for the past 4 weeks has been, what does one do for their 100th episode? Well, after much deliberation, I have decided that in celebration of the 100th, there will be a BSW swag bag giveaway, complete with a t-shirt of your choice from the Firebrand shop at thebiblesayswhat.com, a signed copy of the book, BSW stickers, and cards. So how does it work? For every book review left on Amazon or Barnes & Noble, you will get 1 entry. Every new patron of the show will receive 1 entry. And every t-shirt purchased from thebiblesayswhat.com will get you 3 entries into the drawing. The official rules will be posted at thebiblesayswhat.com. Good luck, everyone. That being said, harmful religious indoctrination centers come in many tax-exempt variations. The church, the cathedral, the Ark Encounter, or the Bible Museum. They are all detrimental to the human race. These places are a facade. They are represented as a safe destination for the whole family. Many people ignorantly believe that taking their children to church or the local theistically propagated and falsely labeled museums will benefit their kids in the long run. Too many believe that sending their kid off to church will give them some sort of divine moral guidance. What you get instead is a child that has now been taught to believe that they are broken and so bad that they need someone to die in their place. Why? Because some ancient humans disobeyed an egotistical monster with a short fuse. According to this monster, this one act of free will now means we all deserve death and torment for eternity. Through centuries of this type of indoctrination, it has become normalized to tell children these lies. The fear of hell and belief in your own brokenness comes with consequences that are scarring for some and deadly for others. My goal with this show is to spread a message of positive atheism while presenting difficult but basic questions to believers around the world. I'm not here to save all the Christians from their toxic belief system. I'm just a drop in the bucket, a ripple of influence in someone's life. I do, however, want that ripple, that wave of doubt that washes through, to stay with them. I'm not here to convince, but to question. And sometimes that's a big enough ripple to start some real changes in the right direction. Let's start the show.
Is there anything in the Bible that you yourself have an issue with? Okay, so it took you reading the Bible to realize that those things were bad for you?
Yeah, it actually did. I
Couldn't
didn't
figure this out on your own?
No, Ted Bundy could be redeemed. God doesn't kill children.
What do you think the Passover was? Yahweh sets up a whole system in the Old Testament where you slaughter animals just so he's able to forgive you.
Today's special guest is author of several critically acclaimed books, including Learning to Speak God from Scratch, Jonathan Merritt. Welcome to the show, Jonathan.
Oh my gosh, it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me on.
I appreciate it, man. Taking the time out from your busy days in New York over there.
Yeah, for sure.
So tell us a little bit about this book, Learning to Speak God from Scratch. How does that work?
Well, I started writing this book when I moved from Atlanta to New York City, actually. And I found that it was a lot more difficult in a new setting to have spiritual conversations, to use sacred language, sacred words that other people were unfamiliar with. And so I began to sort of wonder, I think, what a lot of people wonder, whether it's better to just avoid this kind of conversation in mixed company, or whether in some way these words, these conversations were beautiful and beneficial and worth reviving. And that's really what started the exploration that became this book.
Interesting. So spiritual conversations. What do you mean by spiritual conversations?
It's a big, broad term. What does it mean to have a spiritual or religious conversation? For most people, I think they would say it's a conversation about God. But that's not necessarily what I mean. I think it's bigger and more broad than that. It's talking about things, directing not just our awareness to these things, but directing our conversation to the type of things that you cannot just see and feel that kind of way. So when we talk about, that's a spiritual conversation to me. When we talk about love, that's a spiritual conversation to me. So it's not just conversations about heady, theological, doctrinal type things, although that certainly can count. I'm less concerned about those kinds of conversations. I'm more concerned about having the big, capacious conversations that get down to the ground of things, the real nature of things that is beyond what we can just sort of witness and interact with in the physical world around us.
Such as?
Well, I think, I've got a friend of mine who's writing a book right now on grace. And what does it mean to have grace in a world where so many people in your life, not only do you disagree with them, but you feel like the way in which they're existing, the way in which they're living, the way in which they're interacting with the world around them, in some way falls beneath the standard of acceptability to you. So what does it mean to be in relationship with someone like that? What does it mean to be in relationship with somebody who lives in a way that you feel might even be dangerous or irresponsible, who believes things that you might believe that you might think are narrow-minded or perhaps even bigoted or wrong-headed? What does it mean to love that person? That's a question of grace. How do we begin to talk about grace? So we can just talk about events. We can talk about a person. We can talk about not liking them. We can talk about ideas. But when we get down to the nature of things, the things that are happening all around us in our relationships that are intangible, that to me is a spiritual conversation, and it's an important conversation.
I definitely believe the conversation is very important. That's why we're here. I believe opposites we should hash it out. If you believe one thing, let's find out why you believe it. If I believe one thing, let's figure out why I believe it and who's got the better argument, or at least we can walk away disagreeing, but agreeing to disagree. For sure. So this idea of Yahweh, your God in particular, what is that to you? What is Yahweh to you? What does he represent?
I can tell you for me, I think that, well, let me start here by saying, I went into an intensive counseling program just before the pandemic. I'd had something of just a breakdown, just overwhelmed from life. And I went to a counseling program that was it wasn't specifically a Christian counseling program, but I think it was sort of loosely patterned on kind of AA, which means you were really required in order to get through the program to choose to acknowledge a higher power, a power that's greater than you and outside of you. Now, in my group, it was done in group therapy. You could choose Jesus, you could choose God, you could choose Allah, or you could choose, as some people did in the group, the universe, or you could choose community. Those are powers that exist outside of ourselves. What do we talk about when we talk about God? There was an old preacher, A.W. Tozer, who said, what we think about, what comes to our mind when we hear or we say the word God is the most important thing about us. I don't know that it's the most important thing about us, but I do think that conversations about the power outside of us that is bigger than us, whatever word we use, that's an important conversation. For me, I'm a Christian, so the language and the stories that I use to get at that mystery, I call that thing God. But if we were to peel back all of the Christian stories and language that I've sort of attached to that, if I got down to the core of what that is, I would have to say, really in the way that my sacred text says it, that to believe in God is to believe in love. in the capital L love, not just the little expressions of love that I might have with someone else, but this notion that there is an animating force at the base of everything that we can tap into. And we might call that God, or we might call that love, but if we call it both, we've repeated ourselves.
You called it an animated force, a power that's bigger than us. What exactly does this power, this being do?
Yeah, some people would say, do you believe that God exists? And then other people would say, is existing something even a thing that God does? Or is God beyond existence? It's a big question that you're asking. And I can only tell you, I don't know if I would say that I could give you a full explanation for what I think God does. But I do think that God is. And so there's a thing that we give different names to that we can tap into. It's what you might say is there are people that are even outside of my faith who they live life long enough and they begin to think there's something more. And I call that something more God. It's a mysterious thing. I think different things about that God and what that God does, or what that something more does. And I'll tell you, the things that I put in the list of possibilities for that God have changed over time, which means that I've learned to hold them loosely. I used to think that God was sort of like a bellhop who sort of served needs and you could check things off the list, and I've had to let that go. I used to think that God wanted to contribute to our success or to our health or to an accumulation of wealth to make our lives better in some capitalistic sense. And I've let that go. Instead, I would say that if I had to ask, what is the thing above all other things that I could say I believe God does? I think it's that God offers us presence. Presence, an accompanying presence. I think that God, what does God do? God loves us, and God is with us. The idea that God does for us, or God does to us, or God does on our behalf. I think that those prepositions, those ways of relating to God, I tend to gravitate more toward the preposition of with, or there's a kind of withness that God represents.
So he's just kind of there, just hanging out, watching things happen.
Yeah, that God is, well, again, I mean, observing, yes, but if you think about this in terms of if you've ever had to do something hard, and you think, I don't want to do that alone. Or maybe you've done something wonderful and you think, I wish there was someone here with me to share this with. I think there always is a kind of witness that can be tapped into.
I think that's very interesting. That's very interesting. Now, when I think of something, I'm going through something difficult, I want somebody there with me. I want somebody there with me physically, I mean, if I'm going through a tough time, I want that hug, that physical, touch, that I'm here for you, type thing. But I don't see that happening with Yahweh, because well, first off, he's invisible. So, I mean, we're not here. He's not here. I can't look over and go, hey, Yahweh, how's things going? I'm having a rough day, man. You can't. I mean, that sucks. I mean, that'd be really cool if you had a friend like that. But he's not there for that. I mean, and then even the consoling words, he can't even give you consoling words. I mean, I've heard before, I don't know how you think, but I've heard he'll put a Bible verse in your head and it'll give you comfort reading this Bible verse. And it's like, all right, that's it. I mean, that's not sufficient enough for me. I'm a human being. I need that emotion, that physical, that audible, that real presence, and I see a big difference between Yahweh and an actual human being. And not to go too far here, but you also mentioned universe and community were some of the things that people could and then Jesus and Yahweh. The difference between universe, community, and Jesus and Yahweh is universe and community I can see, I can sense it, I can touch it, I can die in the universe, without all that up there. I can't, be Jesus and Yahweh are completely different, man. It's a big difference for me, and that's how I see it. I'm very curious how that works.
So what I wouldn't say is it's a question of categories. In other words, what I'm not saying is that God equals Allah equals community equals universe. The ways in which we access the things that are outside of us, that are bigger than us, are getting at the same thing in very different ways. So they express themselves differently. I think you're right about the idea that God is not a physical presence in the way that a human being can be a physical presence. But I would say, I remember when I was growing up, there was a movie, you may remember this movie, A Weekend at Bernie's. Do you remember this movie?
Yeah.
And they had this corpse that was dead, but he's flopping around, and they're dragging him around, which is actually it's pretty funny. And there was maybe a couple of them. It was a pretty funny movie. Yeah. But Bernie was physically present in the sense that there was a body there, but there wasn't presence. When I'm saying a capital P presence, something that is beyond the physical realm. And so what I would say is sometimes I think, maybe what we want nothing more than a beating heart. We want nothing more than a pulse. But I think most often there are things that people bring that are the intangibles. And for me, at least, my relationships with people are the things that make the physical presence so beautiful, are the things that are beyond the physical realm. It's things like empathy, curiosity, right? In other words, you can't see empathy or curiosity.
No, but you can see where they come from, though. We can see that it comes from a human being. We know this is where things come from. Yahweh's different. And then I want to go back.
Some people would say it doesn't come from a human being. It comes from your chemicals. It comes from your brain,
which is still human beings. It's still part of
interaction, right?
Yeah.
But we can't see that either.
Well, we can see the brain releasing chemicals and whatnot. We've got all that science now. We can do that.
Right, but I guess what I'm saying is you feel a certain effect and you can ascribe a source to it. But when empathy is happening, you can't say, see this is empathy. You can sort of observe what's happening, and in the space between a you and a me, I'm calling that something. I think in the same way, when we have an experience, whether or not the person or presence is physically there, right? Yeah. I'm calling that something. Now, what I will say is there are people who would say, I don't experience that. And so I don't need to call that something because I don't experience that. And that's also a legitimate, I don't have a respond to that. I'm just saying for me, I have a certain experience with something more, and I'm trying to give language to that. But I'm not saying that, I'm not universalizing my experience to say the way in which you're experiencing life should be the same, and you should use all of the same language that I use.
Well, good. I'm glad we're not. Good.
Right.
I kind of want to go back to that Weekend at Bernie's thing. I love that. That's a great one. That's kind of how I see it. I kind of see Yahweh as this. He's not there, and Christians are giving him life, because in Weekend at Bernie's he wouldn't move, so they had to actually move him and do things for him. That's exactly how I see it. I mean, I'm going to go with faith. It's kind of like just pretending that it's real. We can't see it. It's not really Weekend at Bernie's. He's not really moving. We have to move those strings. We have to do the animating for him. We have to talk for him because he doesn't come down and say things for himself. That's exactly. I love that. That's a great example, though. But yeah, it's kind of like LARPing. Live action role play. It's with the kids get together with their elves and their knives and their, they pretend. It's church for me. Is they're pretending it's there. We're pretending that this being is present, but we really don't have anything besides a feeling that we can't attribute to anything. And I don't think it's logical to really go straight from that to Yahweh. I don't see how that works.
You know, there was a German theologian many years ago who talked about faith as a category epistemologically,
Hmm.
and he called faith not irrational, but supra-rational. In other words, something that exists that transcends rationality. I think the idea that we would say faith or belief in God is not logical is, historically speaking, a uniquely post-Enlightenment Western answer to that question. It doesn't make it a bad answer. But I do think that we can at least wonder whether there are other ways of knowing, right? There is one way of knowing, for example, and I would say it's a way of knowing that in a post-Enlightenment era is only now making a comeback, but I think is a legitimate way of knowing, is experience. And I think that my particular brand of faith, because I would actually agree with you, a lot of what we see today is people using human constructed props that meet their own emotional ego needs and calling it God. And so you might even say, I don't know, it'd be hard to, how do I quantify this? I'll say a large portion of what we call American Christianity is Weekend at Bernie's to some extent.
I love it.
And I think it's one of the reasons why a generation of people are walking away from that, and they're finding spirituality in the most, for them, the most accessible wells of spirituality exist outside of institutional religion for that exact reason. But what I would at least wonder about is whether, when you say it's illogical, if somebody could say, and also, is it possible that we could receive knowledge about this conversation from experience? If that's true, then we might say that we could bring stories of experience alongside each other, which is to say, if your experience is that in these church communities, it feels like pretending, could I accept that as one valid experience while also saying that there are many other people who don't experience it as pretending? And would we be able to bring those experiences into conversation with each other and maybe not harmonize them, but begin to inform them, so that the person who's experiencing faith could say, you know, now that I think about it, there are times in which I'm projecting onto something, a kind of God concept to serve myself. And the hyper-rationalist could say, you know, there are some things that are beyond what I see, touch, taste, smell, that I might not be willing to call God, but I could put in the bucket of the things that I simply don't know. That to me is where conversations of faith begin to really make headway. It's not when we go outside and try to dominate each other with better arguments, but it's really allowing our lived experiences to kind of come in contact with each other and then see what arises out of that.
I totally get the experience part, but I mean, how do you get from I don't know to this is Yahweh? I mean, it's just a feeling. Yahweh doesn't come down personally and greet you. He doesn't say, "Hi, I'm coming into your heart. Here we go." Woo. You know, he doesn't do any of that. How do you know that these experiences are coming from Yahweh? I'm going to go to the Job. I think it's 2:3, where Yahweh admits that Satan has tricked him into doing harm to Job for no reason. So how do we know that Satan's not coming down and just tricking you? Or it's Yahweh tricking you? In 2 Thessalonians, I believe it is, he tricks the Jews. He blinds them and sends them a lie so that they'll believe the lie and then be condemned. I mean, how do we know that it's not any of that? And then how do you know it's Yahweh or anybody in anybody in the Christian religion at all? How do you know it's not the brave little toaster coming down? You know, I mean, there's a lot of different options you have, and you've chosen Yahweh. A lot of people have, and I'm just very curious how to make that leap to Yahweh.
Yeah. Well, I'd say a couple of things. I always, and of course, if you write a book on language, you almost always have to begin conversations with a definition in terms.
Yeah.
And so the question there, how do you know? In a post-enlightenment world, when you say no, you're meaning a cognitive knowledge. It's like a math equation. How can you prove is what you mean when you say no. If you read, for example, the Gospel of John, and by the way, I would say most churches also will use no in the exact same way. Everybody sort of is playing by the same rules. What I would suggest is that when we think about these ancient knowings, they're often experiential knowings. So, John says whatever he means by eternal life, but, I've told you these things so that you would know you have eternal life. And somebody goes, well, you can never know that you have something that doesn't exist now. That's a fair argument. But the word that John uses there is an experiential knowing. In other words, when he's talking about this other kind of life, maybe a deeper life, a fuller life, or some people would posit a post-mortem existence, whatever he means, he's saying, I've told you these things so that you would have an experience, a different kind of experience of life. And so when you ask that question, what I am tempted to do is to simply tell stories. I don't think that would be very convincing to you.
No, I mean, but unless the story was Yahweh came down and said, hi, I'm Yahweh, I'm giving you this experience. Right. I mean, other than that, it's not really, I mean,
right. And I think that's part of the way that experiences work. In other words, my experiences are in some way, they lead me to a level of confidence. I don't have certainty. Certainty is not even something I'm interested in. But I confidence that the path that I'm following, is it the capital T truth? Is it the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help me, universe. I don't like know. But I do know that I'm living within a certain framework that's giving me some tools that at the very least are helping me be a better human, right? And so that to me is I am swimming in a tradition that's giving me some time-tested tools to be generous and to be kinder, to be more present and to be more mindful, be more thoughtful and considerate, and that to me is helpful.
Do you think you could have gotten those tools from somewhere else?
Oh, I don't believe that Christianity is the only game in town in terms of helping you to be a human. But what I would say is, I often will read, there's a former Episcopal priest named Barbara Brown Taylor who talks about this as a kind of, when you go to college, you don't minor in everything. You choose something and you major in it. And what I would say is that there are many pools of wisdom that have been passed throughout the generations to us. And some are more or less helpful than others.
True.
But what I have tried to do is to find a pool that I feel like really seems to resonate with me and to go as deep into that well of wisdom as possible. But when I start to think about things like, well, 2 Thessalonians says this or Job says this, I mean, you have the wrong guy on your show if you're looking for a biblical literalist, because I gave up that drug a long time ago.
Well, I mean, we can both agree that there's some stuff
within that text, a lot of wisdom.
There's some stuff in there that's good. I mean, love your neighbor. I can't argue with that. Great idea. But you know who said it better? Mr. Rogers. I don't have to go through Mr. Rogers' show taking stuff out that I don't like. I don't have to worry about holding my kids' ears or not letting them read certain things Mr. Rogers has said or put on his show. I think Mr. Rogers is more of a moral lightning rod than the Bible will ever be. I mean, the Bible, we can both agree, has some horrible things in it, right? I mean, Yahweh asks for the slaughter of a lot of people. He doesn't say slavery is bad. I mean, women are property, and don't forget the whole bloodshed for forgiveness part. I mean, Mr. Rogers doesn't ask for any of that. Mr. Rogers just wants you to watch a television program and be a better human being. And I'm okay with that. I think that's awesome. I think we should be promoting positive humanity through Mr. Rogers instead of Yahweh, who slaughters people according to the Bible, and needs bloodshed for forgiveness. He's jealous, punishing children. I mean, there's a lot of horrible things in there. Not even mentioning Lot and his daughters.
I'd say a couple things. One,
Yeah.
you when you say, for example, punishment for forgiveness of sins, which is a penal substitutionary atonement theory that really comes to the fore in the Middle Ages, is not a universally accepted way of understanding even that narrative. It's doctrinal, and it's very popular in the United States. Yeah. Or if you say, when Yahweh says, the idea that everything that you read in the Bible is not just the word of God, but it's the words of God.
Well, 2 Timothy 3:16 tells us. Yeah, of course. I mean, because you're going to read the Bible. It tells you to do things. It tells you it's the perfect book. It tells you Yahweh's right or breathed out words are this book. I mean, it makes it pretty important. I mean, it's so important. He's slaughtering people throughout it for not listening to the things that are in his book. So yeah, I mean, if we're not going to, if we can both agree that the Bible has some bad things in it, then why go to that as a source of morals? Why go to that as a source of goodness?
Yeah, I think that one, there's what you're reacting to is something I react to, which is a really flat, terrible reading of an ancient text that is really not a book. It's a library of books written by a range of people over hundreds or thousands of years that comes to us across space and time. And there is an uncanny amount of rich wisdom in that from my perspective, but I don't read it flatly. I would say I would hold it up to a similar standard to the standard of the rest of my life. Do you have children, for example?
Yes, I do.
Okay. So let's say, for example, your kids said, I'm really struggling with something and I want to go talk to dad. I could probably tell them a story about a terrible thing you did when you were 18 years old. I don't know that means that there's nothing you have to offer them as a well of wisdom. In other words, in our lives, we don't only access conduits of wisdom, or we wouldn't access any conduits at all. But if we can come to something understanding the true nature of the thing, then I think we as human beings can access the wisdom that's meant for us, that well can offer us. So in the same way that you're an imperfect messenger of wisdom, but you do access something that transcends just the lifespan of your children. You've been places that they haven't been. You've seen things that they haven't seen. You express a kind of perspective or care. And it doesn't mean that I would say that anything you tell them should be accepted, thus saith the Lord, right? I wouldn't say anything your dad says you must do, and you must do it the way that he says to do it. And if you deviate from that at all, you should be afraid of what he does. That would be an abusive relationship. But if I instead said that your dad does have a lot of wisdom, and maybe you should sample from that wisdom alongside other wells of wisdom that you've come to trust in your life, and give that a seat at the table too, I think that would be a valuable approach for your kids.
So Mr. Rogers is a good source, is what you're saying.
Well, I think the hard thing about Mr. Rogers, I wrote a great piece on him for the Atlantic, actually.
Of course.
He's a big hero of mine. He was a Presbyterian minister who received an ordination to be an evangelist to children on TV. And the epistemology of Mr. Rogers is a Christian epistemology. He would say before every taping, Lord, may some word that I say in this show be yours. The idea that you are special and that there's nothing you can do today to make you more or less special. You've made this day a special day by just your being you, he would say. Is an idea that he derives from a particular reading of this notion that we're all made in the image of God and therefore worthy of certain levels of dignity and respect. Now,
I didn't know that.
The greater point that you're making is let's say that you have someone who isn't a Presbyterian minister who's doing great work, and there are lots of Mr. Rogers who don't believe in God. I still think that that's really wonderful and great. I read authors that aren't Christians. I have friends who are not Christians who I get advice from. I've learned a lot about my own spirituality from other faiths, and from people of other faiths, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And I can still call myself a Christian at the end of the day and return to a certain language and a certain set of stories and live my life alongside those without being so narrow-minded or dogmatic that I miss out on all of the wisdom that's coming to us from other places.
So who, besides the invisible presence, what part of Yahweh do you take away from the Bible? Where I mean, because he's in there. That's where he comes from. That's the concept of this God comes from. Where do you go to get your ideas of this God?
You know, some people start actually with Yahweh. I have a lot of friends who are Jewish, and some of them are more Orthodox than others. So they also have very different ways of understanding Hebrew laws and the sort of the Hebrew scriptures. But if you start from Yahweh, it leads you to a particular kind of faith, or a particular kind of faith practice or tradition. Christians, I think, and this has been my perspective, but it's, again, I'm only giving you I don't claim to speak for all Christians.
That's all I want is your perspective.
I don't even like to acknowledge that other Christians are the same kind of thing that I am sometimes. But I will say, I have always believed that Christians are, even in the name, they're people who follow the way of Jesus, insofar as we can sort of discern that. And so I start with Jesus and reason out. And so when I read things in the broader text, for example, a bad thing happens and the writer says, this is God. If what the writer is saying that God is like is incompatible with Jesus, then it alerts me that there might be something else in that text that I need to investigate. In other words, maybe the real truth of that text is about the ways that we try to use God as an excuse for all kinds of bad behavior. I think you see that happening a lot in the text. I see people using God, saying that God told them something to do bad things, to kill people, for example.
Abraham and Isaac.
I think that's a great story. It does fit, I think, the Jewish, in that era, at least, as some people would say, it fits a Jewish kind of parable.
Such a scary, horrible story, though.
And I would say it doesn't. We tell all kinds of horrible stories. In other words, I've learned things from horror movies.
Well, what's the moral of that story, though? I mean, yeah, true. Don't go in that house.
It depends on how you come at it. If you read it in an ancient sense, many people believe that it was a parable used to essentially put an end to ancient human sacrifice rituals, because that there's this idea that God said we should kill people, but then God says, no, you shouldn't kill people. I provide, right? And so they use that as a way of saying that God wanted us to put an end to these things in ancient context. There's a lot of scholarship that's been written around that, and some scholars have written, and I would say scholars they're not evangelical scholars at Ivy League institutions that would not necessarily spiritualize the text, have said that from an ancient historical perspective, that was certainly the use of it. Of course, there are others who I think could read it in a more mystical way. They would say that actually God never heard or Abraham never heard from God in that text. It was a voice that he heard and that he ascribed to God, which is why when the person stops him, it isn't God. God never says stop. It's a messenger. It's someone else saying don't do this.
Man.
And of course you read in the text, Abraham and Isaac go together. They get up together. They make the journey together. They go up the mountain together. Abraham does this terrible thing and they're together. And then it says, and Abraham came down the mountain. We never see Isaac and Abraham together again. He goes to a far off land. He has no relationship with his father, and he becomes the only patriarch who never has a direct encounter with God. I think in some ways you could read this as a parable of religious abuse.
Interesting point.
What happens when authorities like fathers invoke the name of God to do terrible things to their offspring brings and the way that drives a wedge between them and their families,
Yeah.
between them and the supernatural. And
Wow.
I think it could be read as a cautionary tale.
I agree. I like that. That's a very interesting way to put that. Thank you. Back to Jesus, though. Why is Jesus such a great guy? Where do you get this concept of Jesus being a great guy? Because we got in the Bible, again, we have places where Jesus is, well, number one, he gets angry at the fig tree for no reason. It's just out of fruit. Well, it's out of season, man. You know this. Calm down. Money changers, he gets so mad he starts throwing things. That's anger, man. It's sin, right? You can't let your anger control you like that. How is that a perfect being? And then at the end, he's going to come back with his angel buddies and kill all the non-believers, burn the world up. I mean, where's the good part? I mean, besides the love your neighbor, you know?
You know, I don't, the idea of Jesus, again, which people will make this, there's a kind of reading of the book of Revelation that really originates in the late 1800s. In fact, the book of Revelation was almost not included in the canon, and Martin Luther thought it should be removed. But there is a kind of future version of like warrior Jesus, violent warrior Jesus.
Ninja Jesus.
That's not a picture of Jesus that I make space for in my theology. I think it's based on a kind of science fiction interpretation of a book that probably is telling a kind of fantastical story of what it meant to live as a minority in an empire. But so for me, I would say that to me is not an image of Jesus that I have to reckon with. In the New Testament, there are things that we do read about, and I think that that can feel to people as disconcerting. One of them is you talk about Jesus in the temple turning over tables, and I don't think that the word sin, whatever we mean by that, I wouldn't consider anger to be in that category.
Lashing out on your anger. The violent part of it.
I would say could be true. If you hurt someone, that could be true.
Could hit someone with a table or something. We don't know. It's not in the story.
Right. If you were to hit someone, for example, I think that would be a thing that could be problematic. But having sometimes the absence of anger or the absence of emotion is something that even we modern people who have an understanding of modern psychology, we would say that is disordered. We have words for people who can't feel. We call them sociopaths. The idea that you would see something wrong, for example, somebody torturing an animal or hurting a child, if you don't feel a kind of anger, a restlessness, a desire to intervene in that, that would actually concern me. So to have an idea of a God who sees the terrible things, frankly, that are being done in that God's name, and would not want to insert oneself in that would be more problematic to me than a story of a God or of a reflection of God, a perfect reflection of God, as Christians would say Jesus is, that would say, this is not right, especially if I want to live in the way of that Jesus.
So what do you think happens at the end? What's going to happen when the world, when Yahweh decides time's up, I'm going to end it all? What do you think is going to happen?
Well, if you read in the Hebrew scriptures, the afterlife is almost a non-issue. There's something called Sheol or Sheol. There's the Abraham's bosom. There's this idea that there's a something next, but how can we know? In the New Testament, it sort of is developed a bit, but I would say it hasn't been developed to the extent that most modern American Christians will have you believe. I believe that once we step over from the what's now to the what's next, we have crossed over into the realm of speculation. So I can tell you what I think. I think there is a something next. I think that people, that the intangible parts of ourselves cross over into that reality. And I believe it's a place that's saturated with God, love, capital L, love, capital P, presence. I believe those things. And then sort of beyond that, there's a lot of speculation. But I would say I answer that question mostly with a phrase that I think has been, that is so sacred, but has been desacralized, which is the phrase, I don't know.
He just said my favorite phrase. I love it.
I don't know.
No, exactly. We can't know. There's no way of knowing. Thank you. That's honest. I love it. It's perfect. So as far as the heaven goes, we got that. But what about the end times? Is there going to be end times? Is Yahweh going to set fire to the earth and take his people up to heaven and bad people down to hell?
Yeah, I don't have some view. Well, I think when you get to hell, it's getting really complicated. But if you talk about what happens to all this when the end comes, well, for one thing, we're implying there is some kind of end, a kind of linear. There was a start and there was a stop, and there will be a stop. Mm-hmm. I don't know that there comes a point where there is a kind of destruction of all this. In fact, I believe there probably isn't. There is some sort of picture in the Bible of fire.
Mm-hmm. Lots of places.
And there's an assumption that people make that that notion of fire is something that consumes or destroys. Mm-hmm. But the picture of fire, particularly in ancient sacred literature, is most often not something that destroys. It's something that refines. It clarifies. It purifies. It makes it better, right? Mm-hmm. And so, do I believe that the presence of God or the presence of love could one day come to this place with such a force that it could be made better and purer? It could reach that point. I hold hope for that. And I think that's part of my faith. But the idea of a Jesus riding on a flying unicorn with a blazing fire, a sword coming out of his mouth, killing people and creating pools of blood, and then calling down burning coals to consume all of this, that to me seems beyond the realm of knowing, and certainly inconsistent with the notion of God that I hold to. So I think it would give me a lot of anxiety, and when I used to believe it, it did give me a lot of anxiety.
But
as it should. I hold to
I mean, typically, yeah, that kind of thing definitely gives you a lot of anxiety. I still struggle with that anxiety for sure.
Right.
It sounds like you've created your own Jesus, your own Yahweh, and anything in the Bible that doesn't fit that narrative, that loving idea, is got to be wrong, or there's an obvious other reason for it. I mean, it's very strange to me that the source of this deity is so mysterious and wrong and misinterpreted and everything else. It's very strange. It's very strange. And it's hard to grasp that concept of where it comes from, other than, in your own belief and your own hope and desires for the future.
There's an interesting book that came out recently by religion historian Diana Butler Bass called Freeing Jesus. And she essentially says the only Jesus we can know is the Jesus of, that she calls him the Jesus Christ of experience. In other words, what other Jesus can I talk about outside of the one that I have been taught, that I have received through the filter of my cultural lens, of the way I was raised? And we're all trying to make sense of this. There was at Yale University in the 1980s, there was a scholar named Yaroslav Pelikan who wrote a book called Jesus Through the Centuries. And he said every generation has come to find its own understanding, crystallization, image of Jesus, that in some ways is a reflection of its own character, or maybe formulates a kind of answer to its deepest questions. So the idea that we have another Jesus other than the one we make for ourselves, is a kind of odd notion that there's a static Jesus out there that everybody's always believed in, and then I just come up with my own Jesus. You know, when you say the word Jesus, you're pointing to a kind of thing. And the truth is, not every person who says that word is pointing to the same thing across space and time.
Right.
And so we're all trying to figure out along these versions of what we're calling Jesus, is there something there that we might call real? And would it be beneficial to investigate that? I mean, I've come away with the answer yes to both those questions, but a lot of other people say no to one or both.
But the one thing that's universal is everybody seems to, well, mostly the religious people, all seem to agree that this Jesus is loving, that he's this super awesome guru, and we should all follow him and listen to him, and he's going to help us through life. And where does this ultimate love come from? That you have to throw out a lot of the Bible in order for this ultimate love to be present. For instance, Jesus' death. Why do you think Jesus had to die?
Yeah, it's a big question. I think, you know, you've said something there that I'm curious about, because the idea that if I don't like something, I have to throw it out. There are texts of what you might call terror in the Bible. And I am not one of those people who says we should throw it out. But I do wonder if those texts either make us less human, more afraid, more hateful.
Yeah.
If they give us anxiety, there's another option, which is to say there are other ways of understanding things like that. In other words, there are probably parts of your past, as your own sort of infleshed book of knowledge that you are. There are stories that you've lived that even you might say represent a kind of snapshot of your own journey toward being human, but it's not the snapshot that you would adopt today. And yet you might tell that story in a way today it's not the way you would have told it before, which is to say, maybe you would have told your story being 16, and you would have, when you were 16, and said, see how I am, you should be just like that. You can tell that same story at 36 and say, see how I was, don't be like that. The story doesn't have to go away, but we can tell it, interact with it in ways that are different. And so I often say, I want to take the whole Bible as its whole self, but I might interact with parts of it in a way that are very different than some other Christians would.
Yeah, I'm going to have to disagree with you there. I think that we should probably throw out a lot of it, such as the kill the homosexuals, women are property, we can keep slaves, rape. There's a lot of issues with rape in there. Incest is how Yahweh created things, kept things. There's a lot. There's a lot in there I would not let my children read. And to have that inside of a good book, and that's an issue. I think we should definitely throw out a lot of this. It's caused us, throughout history, it's caused us a lot of issues. Kill witches, for one. I mean, how many countless people have died because some idiot said the Bible said kill witches, so I got to do it. I mean, come on. I mean, that's a lot in there. Lots to tackle. Yeah. Lots to just cut it out. Keep the, love your neighbor part. I don't understand why even bother.
I right before the pandemic, I saw a show on Broadway, and I hate to say I only got to see the first. There's two halves of it. I only got to see the first half, then it shut down. It was called The Inheritance. And it was about the AIDS epidemic in New York City that happened, that's claimed millions of lives. And everyone was so disturbed and heartbroken in that show to come face to face with stories of men who were horrifically rejected from their homes. Many of them died alone, gruesome deaths, unable to get medicine that quite frankly should have existed but had been blocked. The money for research had been blocked early on by conservatives. I left that place profoundly disturbed by the horror that I confronted. But I don't know that I came away saying we shouldn't tell those stories. I think we must tell the stories of terror. I think we have to tell stories of people oppressing women and using God to do it. I think we have to tell stories of people enacting violence against gay people and trans people and people they don't understand and people who look different than they do, and people who call God by a different name or don't have a name for that at all. I think we have to tell those stories. I think it's good for us to tell those stories. But what you're saying that I absolutely agree with is we have to tell them in the right way.
Context, yeah.
I think if you tell them in the wrong way, or if you put God in the wrong seat in that story, if you claim that the villain is actually the hero, well, then you're right. I think that that a story is a powerful thing, but a story has to be used in the right way. And I think you're absolutely right that there are a lot of stories in the Bible that are both terrible and incredibly pliable. And they can be misused, and history has told us this. Yeah. They can be misused in terrible ways. I will say, though, there is a minority report, and it's the minority report that's told in the American Civil Rights Movement, as well as the abolitionist movement, in the abolition of the slave trade in the United Kingdom, the kind of Jesus that Gandhi drew from. There are other ways to use those stories that are also incredibly beautiful. And so if what you're saying is we should protest the violent misuse and misunderstanding of outdated fundamentalist readings of the Bible, well, if there's a picket line for that, I'll join you. I'm right there with you.
Awesome. I just want to show you my Bible real quick. There's a reason for that on there, you know?
Yeah. Right.
Absolutely, man. Because, I mean, if Mr. Rogers had an episode where he was promoting killing anybody, they would have taken that off. You know, they would have rejected that as an episode. That's not what we want. That's not how we, or you know, like nowadays we put a warning in this is what happened during these times. These are why this is happening, why they said these things, because we've progressed as a human species past our, well, not all of it, but, you know, past our issues and hate and all that stuff. We're working on it. We're getting better. Yeah. I think we're getting a lot better. But why did Jesus have to die? I don't think we answered that one. Let's finish with that awesome question right there. Why did Jesus actually physically have to die?
You know, the Bible gives a lot of answers to that. And then human beings have given even more. Most of them incomplete, and a lot of them really dangerous. I tend to think that one really good answer is that if you are a person who seeks to truly love your neighbor as yourself, if you devote yourself to the healing of the world, it will place you in direct conflict with selfishness and greed and power, which is to say, it will place you in direct conflict with the people who have every means to kill you, both physically and also financially,
mentally,
emotionally, reputationally, psychologically. And so the idea is that when we follow that way, it almost always leads us to the point of a kind of death of some way. In other words, Jesus had to die because the world as it is almost always punishes those who take the better path. Of course, we're seeing that now. If you want to be president, I think that as much as I kind of like Joe Biden, I'm not making a partisan statement. I like Joe Biden. He certainly is better than the last, guy we had, I think by almost any objective measure. But in order to sit in that seat, I have the belief that you've got to do some things that probably I would disagree with vehemently to get to that place. And so in order to scale the ladders of power and wealth and success, you have to compromise. You have to do some things that maybe you wouldn't do. There are times where you have to love yourself more than your neighbor so that you can get ahead. There are times when, like the parable, the story in the New Testament of the rich young ruler, you have to say, I'm not willing to walk away from what I can have so that others can have. And that's the game that's played. So what would happen to a person who in every situation chose neighbor over self, chose you over just me? And by the way, I'm not saying we shouldn't care for ourselves and love ourselves, because we should. But what would happen? Well, I think you end up on a cross. We nail together crosses these days, but I see lots of crosses on Twitter, and I see lots of crosses on Facebook, and I see lots of crosses in the marketplace when people stand up to naked capitalism and say, this is not the way. This does not make us better humans than we are. It doesn't narrow the gap between is and ought. So I think Jesus had to die, because what else could someone like Jesus do in the face of violence and in the face of power?
So if it's just a natural end to standing up against bad ideas, what makes it so great?
Well, I think it shows us a way. It gives us a path to walk in. Most of us, I think, will never, this idea that you're not going to be Jesus. If you are, you might find that you end up dying a kind of death.
Nobody's going to worship me when I'm gone, though.
That's right. And
That's
so
a lot different.
The idea is that could we in some way imperfectly walk this kind of life? It says that Jesus emptied himself. I think about that as a kind of rejection of the Jungian ego.
Oh, sounds like he had to pee.
In our own ways, right.
Jesus just emptied himself, and then you got to interpret it.
Probably did that too. But Paul talks about the old man and the new man, or in psychology we might talk about the true self and the false self. I think that there are paths that the way of Jesus leads us to walk, and Jesus's whole story tells us, but beware. Because it may take you to a place that you'd rather not go, because this is a dangerous, dangerous world. And people don't always honor those of us who are trying to live in that kind of existence, I think.
I find it interesting. There are a lot of people throughout history who have died for selfless, also selfish, but selfless reasons for the good of everybody else, and these people aren't worshipped. These people are deified and seen as the ultimate source of morality and whatnot. Why not? Why Jesus, who, well, I guess you just throw those stories out, but why Jesus?
Well, I think that when you talk about worship, the question is what do we mean, again, when we say worship? I'd say if I can peel back a lot of that, one of the words at the core of the word worship for me is the word wonder or awe. When I read the stories of Jesus, I am in awe. Because the stories of Jesus place the story of Jonathan at conflict. I begin to see the decisions that I have made that have served only myself. I see the times in which I don't love my enemies as myself. I see the times in which I don't turn the other cheek, but I return violence for violence. When I seek revenge and I seek hate. And so for me, I do have a kind of wonder and a kind of awe that stirs with me when I read the story of Jesus, that for me at least, doesn't happen when I encounter the stories of other people. Well, and the word that we place on that experience is worship.
What about the experiences of or the story of Frodo, Lord of the Rings? Dude sacrificed so much just to save so many. He even befriended Gollum, who clearly was out to get him the whole time, so he's friends with his... I think that's a great story. And then Sam stuck with him. Go Sam. Yeah, it's a great story. I think that something like that can inspire me to be a better human as well. A better hobbit, if that be the case. But,
yes.
I don't I don't see why we need Jesus so much. I mean, we can literally get rid of this whole thing and still have a ton of books that are good for moral learning and teachings, you know?
I read those too. I like those books. I saw, there's the Morgan Library Museum in New York, again, right before the pandemic. Pandemic ruined everything.
Yeah.
But they had a Tolkien exhibit, and Tolkien and C.S. Lewis were very good friends. And you will find that a lot of the archetypal wisdom, right? That's the thing about the Bible. The Bible in itself is just words. It's the thing behind the Bible. Things like goodness and mercy and love and compassion. It's the thing behind the things that the Bible is pointing to or getting at that are of interest to me. A lot of people have produced other literature, other works of literature that get at those same archetypal truths. And they're also really, really good. I love those works, and I get at those works too. And I think you're right. You can supplant many of the stories in the Bible with other stories that are also excavating those archetypal truths. And I think those are also great stories. There's
a book here. It's called The Teachings of Theotep. I think it's the original book we found. It's got a lot of good moral things in here. It precedes the Bible. We had these great ideas before the Bible came along. So in my opinion, we could have done without it, and we've done a great job. Less killing, I believe, in the
and I'll tell you, what I'm not saying, I don't believe the Bible created mercy or compassion or love.
Good.
But it is a tool for talking about those things, and there are tools for talking about those things that predate the Bible, just like the things that they're all talking about predate the Bible. So to that I say, there are lots of creation myths that are getting at the same sort of questions of human existence, and so I wouldn't say, I'm not saying that the Bible is the only game in town if you want to interact with some of these archetypal ideas. It's just the one that I've chosen to live alongside, but it doesn't mean it's the only one. It's, for me, is the most important one that I've chosen to live my life alongside.
Gotcha. And as far as tools go, if I'm going to hammer in a nail, yes, I can use a saw, but the better tool would be a hammer. I don't need all that pointless stuff as far as the hammering in a nail. So, but last words. I'll let you have the last words.
Which I'll say, even the metaphor there is a very post-Enlightenment, almost a utilitarian metaphor. In other words, that the value of something is based upon how well that something allows you to do something else. So the idea of the Bible as a means to an end rather than an end in itself. I don't know that the Bible, for me, can be reduced to a kind of utilitarian function. If I need to raise my children, and I only get one book to tell me how to be a good parent, and it has to give me the practical things. How do I bathe a child? How do I talk to it? How do I have the sex talk to a child? How do I probably wouldn't choose the Bible if I got to choose one. I probably wouldn't.
That's good. That's good.
I don't think that it is the idea that it's like, as evangelicals would say, it's God's instruction manual for life. That's one way, I think, of seeing the Bible. But I think if you follow it as if it's instructions on how to live, depending on which book you choose and which verse you choose, you're not going to be living necessarily the best 21st century life, but you might be living one version of a 4th century BC life. And I don't know that crosses over well, or that serves us well, because we've learned a lot since that was written
Just a
by
little.
that one guy. So for me, the Bible, I would think of it as the Bible as companion. And I have lots of different companions. But in this category of companions, the category of books, it's one companion that I've decided that it sojourns with me really closely. It's not the perfect and it's not the only, but it is sort of my closest companion for living. And I don't discount that other people have found companionship in others, and that those other companions are deeply impactful and valuable. And many of them have even been valuable companions for me as well.
Well, I thank you for your time today. Why don't you end it and tell us where we can find your book?
Well, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, anywhere that as they say, that books are sold, and people can find me on social media as well. But this has just been really delightful, and your questions are fantastic. So thank you so much.
Thank you, man. I appreciate all your time and your answers, especially the I don't know. It's my favorite one.
Yeah. I wrote an article. People will not find it under this name. It's about Lauren Daigle, who, when she was asked about LGBTQ equality, she said, I don't know. I was taught this thing, and I'm in the process of reconsidering the thing I was taught. And right now, I don't know. And everyone was upset with her. And I wrote a column for the Atlantic. I think it's called Lauren Daigle and the Lost Art of Discernment. And what I want to say what I wanted to say in that article, and I may have had a better question than answer, so I'll preface it if you don't like the answers that I come to. I hope it's a good question. And the question is would it be good for us as people who don't know everything to recover the lost art, or I would say the sacredness of saying, I don't know? And could we make space for other people who similarly don't know?
Absolutely.
Even if we think that we know the things that they claim not to know. And if people want to read that, they can read that at the Atlantic. It's about the lost art of discernment. So you and I are simpatico, man, in that. I hope the older I get, I say I don't know more, and that more of my conversations that I have with people, the sentences that I speak will end with question marks and not periods, certainly not exclamations.
Awesome. I appreciate that a lot. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll talk to you later, man. I'll let you know when this comes out.
All right. Thank you. Hey, by the way, are you from the South?
No. California.
Is that where you were born and raised in California?
Born and raised in California. I probably called you dude a few times here.
Okay. I couldn't quite tell. It had a kind of like Florida vibe, but that was like, North Florida vibe to me. But now that you say it, I can see like surfer dude.
Definitely California. Yeah, I grew up next to the beach and all that fun stuff. So yeah.
Oh, wow. Fantastic. Thank you for having me on. It was my pleasure.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We'll talk to you later, man.
All right. Bye-bye.
The show there is for you today. Thanks for listening. BSW has a new Love Me 3 Times patron, Tyson Williams. Thank you for your support, Tyson, and all the extra love. If you like what you heard and want to help keep the recording light on, simply go to patreon.com/BSW the podcast and sign up to be a supporter of the show. Your episodic tithes of $1 or more will give you access to the patron feed, unaired conversations, early access to each episode, and much more. For the latest events, BSW swag, and a peek behind the scenes, head over to the show's ever-evolving webpage at thebiblesayswhat.com. The Bible Says What the book is out. Head on over to thebiblesayswhat.com and get yourself and your grandma a signed copy. Supplies are limited. Thanks to the cosmic powers of the internet, it is now possible to buy me a beer or coffee online. Simply go to buymeacoffee.com/BSW the podcast and click the appropriate buttons. If you can't support the show monetarily, please like, share, and or leave a review. As always, you can find me at the Bible Says What Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, or Instagram pages. You can also reach me at bswthepodcast@gmail.com. And no matter which platform you use to listen to your podcasts, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss out on the next episode. Until then, would you kindly pick up your Bibles and read them? La